There's no doctor in the United States that would say we have 35% ADHD people.
This was a big study, Sarah.
They flag that as a limitation, which is interesting because it sounds like a win to me. I don't know.
This is great. Awareness. Brilliant.
If you don't have ADHD symptoms by then you don't have childhood presentation.
And you can never be diagnosed no matter how much it affects your life for the rest of your life. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's research recap. Today, we're going to be talking about two very interesting papers and a screener, which they've gone to great lengths saying is a screener, to do with ADHD. We're going to be talking about, is there differences in ADHD between countries, between regions, and why that might be as well. So we've got two papers here today and one assessment test. So we're going to talk about the first paper and then we'll talk about the assessment as well. Sound good? Ready to go, Sarah?
Yes, I am so ready. This is going to be a really interesting topic because we're pretty much just talking about like variation in whether you get diagnosed or sort of like what are the potential factors for all of that. So both of these papers kind of cover different angles of that conversation. So it's really interesting. I'm ready.
Awesome. So the first paper looks at cross-cultural adult ADHD assessment, which I think is really interesting, in 42 countries using the adult ADHD self-report screener. And what they basically wanted to know was pretty simple. Does the prevalence rate of ADHD differ across countries? And they also looked at a few other, things that might be connected to ADHD and looked at whether those differed as well. So do you want to take us through how they did this? Because this was a big study, Sarah.
Yeah, it's a really large sample pool. So the overall sample for this study is 72,627. So wow. Also palindrome, right? Anyway,
I did not see that.
It just hit me in the face. But it's important to note that this study is like drawing from existing data that was done, the International Sex Survey, which is like all self-report. It was all done online. This is how they got so many participants, right? Yeah, so that comes with all the normal limitations.
Yeah. This is also how they had so many people. If you look at the number of authors on this study, it's more than I've seen in a while. It's like, 30 different authors on the study?
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason that I put the citation on our notes to the smallest possible font. A paragraph. The authors is a paragraph, yeah. Anyway, so then they also have sort of other measures, as Skye alluded to, in particular, the most important thing I think is that ADHD was measured using the ASRS, which is the Adult Self-Report Scale. Now, they talk about this a lot in the paper. It's sort of just a self-report assessment. I found it. So we can talk through the questions if we'd like. But they were also sort of given another questionnaire. Well, I suppose I should say they pulled data where they were asked about physical, mental, or sexual conditions or disorders. And then they also they also answered questions about quality of life to determine sort of socioeconomic status.
Yeah, definitely. Do we want to get into the ASRS screener now, or do we want to give them the results and then talk about the screener?
I think we should talk about it at the end because it really relates to the whole, like, what are we measuring conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it'll have more context sort of later on. So we'll move on to what they found because, it's all, the methodology is questionnaires, self-report.
Yeah. So what they found was a huge prevalence of ADHD. So they found that the prevalence of ADHD in different countries varied from 9% to 32%. And generally speaking, the estimate was 20%, which was over the amount of ADHD that people tend to think that they are going to find. I think sometimes people say it as 5%. The places where there was the highest prevalence was in the US and Canada. The lowest was actually in Germany, but in the middle there were a lot of places that were considered like South Asian or places like that where there was a generally low prevalence. I think if I just find that section of the paper, there was two geographic areas, they said there was a particularly low prevalence.
They do actually go into the cultural implications, access to resources and things like that. They actually conceptualize, they just refer to it as weird countries. It's an acronym.
It's not what you're thinking.
It stood for the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. And the authors of this paper were like, hey, since the prevalence rates are higher here, maybe we should like do additional research on maybe either why that is or whatever. But yeah, it was interesting that they grouped them all together. But I do think it points to definitely cultural differences.
Cultural differences for sure. I mean, because they said, I just found that bit in the paper, they said the lowest occurrence was found in a more diverse group of countries, including non-English speaking European countries, as well as East Asian countries. And that they identified Germany, North Macedonia, Taiwan, Israel, Lithuania, Hungary, and South Korea. That was the lower rate of ADHD where they found that. So they also found a little bit around, women reported more serious ADHD symptoms than men in this study, which I thought was interesting because we don't always talk about, women depending on the study. Gender diverse individuals had a higher occurrence of ADHD symptoms than those who identified as cisgender. Socioeconomic status was weakly negatively correlated with ADHD. So if you were wealthier or you identified as, having more wealth, there was some negative correlation with ADHD, but it wasn't very high. So they sort of mentioned specifically with the socioeconomic status and the things that came into that, they sort of said it was about what you'd expect. And it is. I mean, it's all those kind of negative outcomes linked to ADHD papers that we don't talk about, but that get published fairly regularly.
One other thing that got missed here is actually two things. There was a strong positive correlation between ADHD and having another mental condition, which basically just means you're much more likely to have more than one thing. And then they also found a strong negative correlation between ADHD and age, which means that like the people who were diagnosed with ADHD were younger. And I think that also speaks to, again, that cultural sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Generations can be culture too. Sorry, sociology hat off. No, put it back on. I'm just kidding.
People, we never take that hat off.
Yeah, can't help it. My comfort item, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but so that's all like really interesting stuff. I think it sort of paints a picture about like who's getting care, who knows stuff. When we sort of picked out this study, because the study is from this year, 2024. Yes. We sort of were like, okay, cool, but we need something else. And so I ended up finding something looking at regional variations in diagnoses. And that had some interesting things to add to this conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we'll get there in a minute. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the limitations here. I mean, the data that they used wasn't originally intended to be used for this purpose, right? It only looked at like one ADHD thing. The ASRS is just a screener tool. And so they flag that in their limitation section as being more prone to false positives, which means like capturing more ADHD than is there, which is fine if it's just used as a screener tool anyway.
Yeah. Like they said, they found more ADHD in all countries than, what you would tend to find.
Yeah. I mean, 35% is huge. There's no doctor in the United States that would say we have 35% ADHD people.
Yeah.
There is no one that bold.
And that was the biggest thing. They were like, take it with a grain of salt. This is based on a screener that is not a diagnostic tool. But it was also an interesting, in terms of the people who self-assessed, because it was a self-assessment screener as having ADHD. They talked about maybe a lack of knowledge about ADHD, but I also wondered if it was a lack of acceptance of ADHD. It's possible that in certain countries, the idea of having ADHD is something that people are comfortable acknowledging, whereas maybe in other places where it's less accepted, it might be some people don't feel comfortable, even if they saw the list of things and felt that it did relate to them, they wouldn't want to acknowledge it. Because I can definitely relate to that. And I think a lot of people have had that experience as part of their diagnostic discussion.
I think that is very true. And I don't even think my next point negates that. They go on to talk about how some of the ADHD symptoms that are being asked about in this questionnaire can present as a result of other conditions, right? Like anxiety, mood disorder, substance use disorder. And so like the cultural sort of bias of the clinician or whoever you're in front of might be more likely to see it as a mood disorder. Or if you're like before them because you got in trouble, then they're going to be like, oh, of course you have a substance use disorder, right? Like this isn't ADHD. So anyway, you know, just sort of another side to that.
Yeah, that kind of speaks to this very, very complex nature of the diagnosis. I mean, we know this, we talk about it all the time, but it's this concept of being like, okay,
I know, here we are again.
What is it? Like, what is it based on who you are, what country you're in, what you are comfortable acknowledging, what other people are comfortable acknowledging? There's so many different factors that can go into those different diagnoses across countries or different screeners across countries.
That was a fantastic segue into the next paper because they wanted to know that also.
Yeah, exactly. Hi, Sky here, just popping in with a quick strategy for you. As some of you might know, we've recently launched the Goals Achieved with ADHD Academy, and some of our members kindly agreed to have their sessions recorded so that I could share them with you. So what you're about to hear is a snippet of a strategy that Amani and I worked on to help her with her goal of getting a job. So hopefully you'll find this strategy helpful. And if you'd like to talk with me about how you can achieve your goals with ADHD, just click the description below to book a free 15-minute focus session and we'll get started together.
How do we beat that procrastination, rejection sensitivity cycle around this incredibly complicated, incredibly rejection sensitive thing?
Applying for a job brings up so much in me. I'm giving myself these deadlines, which are my kryptonite. If I were anybody else, I would be like, it is not a big deal. What matters is that you get them out.
There's different parts of applications in general. Some of them are rejection sensitive, some of them aren't. We need to divide tasks into things that are stressful and things that are not stressful. Do the more relaxed bits, and then we're going to get a bunch of dopamine and chunk together all of the stressful bits and do those together. We want to separate the writing the application self and the sending the application self. How do you feel about the strategy? Are you happy with that as a thing to try?
Yes. Very, 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 very excited about it. That sounds great.
So let's go right ahead and we'll talk about the next paper, which basically the name of this paper is Geographical Variations in ADHD. Do diagnoses reflect symptom levels? And it's from the Journal of European Child Adolescent Psychiatry from 2023. And what they wanted to know was pretty simply, do ADHD symptom variations explain the regional variations in ADHD diagnosis? And this paper is from Norway. So, Sarah, do you want to take us a little bit deeper into what this means? Because I think it can be a bit confusing. I was a bit confused when I first read it myself.
Yeah, of course. So it was a little bit confusing because really this paper is looking at individual data, but it's really trying to assess like the data on a clinic level. So like a region. So instead of individual, we're looking at like regions. And so that's what sort of complicates it a little bit. But, you know, they basically just wanted to look at that from three different ways. You know, they wanted to look at like the total symptom prevalence in each region and see if like certain regions had like higher amounts of symptoms than would be expected. Same thing with sort of actual diagnoses.
What did they think might be happening if there was a difference in these regions?
Their very lengthy limitations section actually discusses that.
Yep.
Seriously.
Biggest limitation section ever.
Yeah, it was so great. They actually say, and they list this in their limitation section, I say again, areas that have a higher awareness of ADHD and like what is ADHD are just naturally going to have more people getting referred, more people getting diagnosed. And so it just creates more awareness and so more diagnosis. And so, they flag that as a limitation, which is interesting because it sounds like a win to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm like, this is great. Awareness. Brilliant. So, okay. So what were the results? Let's jump into them.
Sure. Well, we didn't say that this data is a combination of population-based survey data, sort of like the Sweden National Registry data, and they're using sort of really advanced statistical methods that we're not really going to discuss. Way like, woo!
But no, 100%.
Yeah, we're looking at like 1999 to 2008, and there was a little bit of a longitudinal aspect where they sort of checked in with at 2011, 2016, they looked at all the new diagnoses, all the new ADHD diagnoses that were made. They sort of measured ADHD symptoms based on, does symptom prevalence vary by clinic or region? So like, does one clinic have way lots more symptoms and people getting diagnosed versus others? And then they also established a percentile, like if you scored 90th percentile on this, that was the baseline for diagnosis.
Right.
Because they say in the paper that this is not standardized. It's, again, up to clinicians' discretion.
Yeah. And it's a self-report again. So, okay. So in terms of this idea, what I was really curious about was, this is a bit of an aside, actually. They mentioned that this is a longitudinal study with a 41% participation rate. What was the drop-off between 1999 and 2008?
So it's sort of not longitudinal in that way. The 41% participation rate is the people who originally participated in 1999 to 2008. I said longitudinal aspect because really all they did was they looked at, again, the registry data from 2011 to 2016 for like who was diagnosed. And they just sort of extrapolated that those were the same people, or at least some of the same people, or at least it didn't really matter that much. But no, good, because I totally glossed right over it because it's a huge sample. I mean, we're talking
it's
like
a massive sample.
114,000 children.
A huge sample.
And 95,000 mothers. Yeah.
The reason I mentioned it was because last time we spoke, there was a longitudinal study that had a huge drop-off. And I felt kind of bad about being so hard on their drop-off rate. I thought maybe it was more normal. I've literally been thinking about that all week, being like, maybe I was too harsh on that paper. So just know, I do think about these things.
Yeah, for sure. I think we both do.
Yeah, well, we know how hard it is to make these things and how much work goes into them. Okay, getting back into it. So what were the results then? What did they find?
Yeah, now we can scooch into results. By and large, incidence of ADHD diagnosis in their study period was 1.6%, which is low.
Especially compared to the previous study.
They stated in their paper that 5% is sort of the expected prevalence in Norway.
Yes, that's what I thought. I said that. Yeah.
That is what it said in the paper. However, I will note that that's the cumulative incidence between 2011, 2016. There may have been ADHD diagnoses previously. I don't know why they didn't just look at like earlier. I can't do the math really quickly enough, but that looks like 12-year-olds to... Oh, okay. I just figured it out. The reason that they looked at those years is because that's when all those children would have been 12. Anyway, okay.
Right.
There you go. Okay. And 12, if you don't know, is sort of the cutoff for if you don't have ADHD symptoms by then you don't have childhood presentation.
And you can never be diagnosed no matter how much it affects your life for the rest of your life.
Okay, now I've connected all the dots for myself. We can move on. I'm so sorry.
It's all good. No, you're good.
I will say there was nearly 10-fold difference in diagnosis rates across the different healthcare clinics. And that means that there was a huge discrepancy. Like, I don't even think that was big enough emphasis, but I'm not going to do it again.
But it was definitely a big discrepancy. And this paper found what they were looking for. So congratulations to them. They did find this difference. And, it was a massive one. And I guess my question for that is then, if we have this small number of people diagnosed with ADHD and we find this huge variance, what were some of the reasons that they thought it might be happening?
They said that there was no significant association between the symptoms themselves and diagnoses, at that 90th percentile threshold. They said even after accounting for those symptom level differences, there was still some significant unexplained variation across clinics. They said it's much higher than would be expected by chance.
They did mention one reason I thought was quite interesting, which was they thought that maybe it had to do with families and genetic association of ADHD.
Yeah, increased heritability rates mean that there's going to be more people in a similar area sort of having the symptoms, having the diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah.
Sure.
It was kind of interesting though, because I think one of the reasons is the one that you mentioned just before, which is potentially there's an awareness of ADHD in certain areas. I also wonder if, certain areas might be more city-based and whether ADHD geographic differences might partially be a result of like people with ADHD want certain kinds of things, and those certain kinds of things are more likely to be found in certain kinds of places. And so, basically they want dopamine. And so, maybe that's part of the reason, maybe people with ADHD naturally group into a certain area.
Looking for community.
Yeah, looking for community, connecting with each other. Maybe they group around things like universities or places where there's lots of like learning and or spaces where they're like, people talk about like San Francisco or places like that as being highly neurodiverse because it's a space where jobs for neurodiverse people are more available or the kinds of jobs you might want if you're a neurodiverse person. So there's lots of different reasons why this could happen. The other reason that I don't know if they went into, we'll talk about the limitations in a minute, is maybe they have a diagnostic clinician who's pretty easy with the diagnoses. That's also a possibility.
Or the other way around, right? They
the other way around.
About clinician bias a little bit. They do talk about how difficult it is to do randomized controlled sort of studies like this. They say that they're the first that they know of that tried to look at regional differences within the same country. And so they went through great lengths to make sure that we understood what they were saying.
Yeah.
And what they were not saying.
Yeah, definitely. Well, do you want to go into that? Do you want to talk about what was it, like 10 limitations? 7?
Yeah. So first up on the list is ecological bias, which I actually had to look up because I've never seen it in this context that I could remember. And it was just a shout out from the authors to make sure that you stay focused on the fact that this is regional data. This is not like individual level stuff.
So good,
even us saying right now that like, there might be one clinician who's easy on the diagnoses or not. That's even still, we're doing it right now.
They're calling us out. I appreciate it. Right I appreciate it.
Yeah. And also like from their perspective, they had to make sure that like their control group or whatever wasn't tarnished, I guess, by all of the individual findings. They also called out statistical bias in the fact that these questionnaires and things, there's like inconsistent scoring. Oh gosh, now I need to find this part in the paper because all I put in my notes is, in quotations, chance findings. What?
And then underneath it, you just wrote, seriously, they are still listing them.
Yeah. I couldn't believe it. And then they continued for like another page. I was just like, wow.
Yeah, you gave up listing at this point.
I think that might be true. Oh, 6th, a concern may be chance findings. Like due to sample size, statistical power, or researcher degrees of freedom. Yeah, no, that's really like, that's what they wrote. Chance findings, potentially.
Which I love. We should write that as a limitation for every single paper.
Yeah, everything. Like, yeah, coincidence? Yeah, sure. Sure, why not? oh no. And then they go on to say sixth again. So they actually have like 7 limitations in here, guys. Count them. 7, maybe. They say that they sort of only look at kids up until they're 8 years old, but then they go back and look at them at 12. And so, you know, that's not perfectly generalizable.
They also said there's just a higher awareness in certain areas, which could be a limitation, which we kind of already touched on. Basically, they wanted us to know there were a lot of reasons that the study might not be relevant, and I appreciate it.
And they end by saying that future research should really look at this geographical variation, or maybe look at medication rates, because this is hard to design randomized experiments around. And so, but it's still important to know about more, I think. This was the only other paper that sort of fit the bill. And so I was really happy that it was open access, because I totally procrastinated. I needed it to be open access, and it was.
Yeah, no, 100%. Okay, so I guess in terms of those practical implications then, you know, this is a diagnostic process discussion. Like a lot of these papers, you know, although the outcomes were really interesting and they told us lots of different things, including all the reasons why we shouldn't take it too seriously, a lot of it was about kind of the importance of how we are getting diagnosed and what that means and what that looks like. So should we dive into one of the most popular self-report scales and what it is about? Give you guys a little bit of a sense of what you can expect, or maybe, you know, a reminder of what you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like talking about this screener tool is the implication of both of these papers, because one paper used it to totally represent ADHD and the other paper was like, you know, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah. So if we have a look at the self-report scale, I think it's interesting to look at it because it's technically written from the perspective of the person who's doing the diagnostics, not the person who's getting the diagnosis or taking the screener. So basically what it is, it's 18 criteria, and what they want you to do is they want you to complete 2 sections using a scale of never to very often. And if you have 4 or more marks in areas that they've darkly shaded, that I assume aren't darkly shaded for the person taking the test, otherwise it would be funny, then you have something that's considered highly consistent with adult ADHD. And it's also important to note that then they want you to evaluate it with your patient, consider work, school, family settings, and also consider symptoms in childhood. And it says adults who have ADHD need not have been formally diagnosed in childhood. If evaluating a patient's history, look for evidence of early appearing and long-standing problems with attention or self-control. Some significant symptoms should be present in childhood, but full symptomology is not necessary. So that's quite interesting as well from the perspective of the person doing the test.
Yeah, definitely. It gives them a lot of really good instructions. I think that's great. I am really interested to talk about the items that are in that part A, sort of that first.
Yeah, like, go for it, Sarah.
How do you score on these? So the very first one is how often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? Oh my goodness. It can be excruciating.
It's a great question.
Depending on what the final details are. How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization?
Yeah, 100%.
How often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations?
Which I think is sometimes the first thing that people figure out how to manage. When we have clients join us, one of the things we do is we give them not this, but sort of our own version of a test to see how they're doing. And I find this is the one people tend to, as adults, have either figured out some strategies for or get a bit of a sense of. It's the other ones that are a particular struggle. I think they're more complex.
Fidgeting is also in this part A section. And then actually the last one in part A was personally really triggering to me when I was getting my assessment because I didn't know how to answer it, right? Like I was afraid to be honest. Okay, and I'll tell you why. So it's how often do you feel overly active and compelled to do things like you were driven by a motor? And when I heard it, I was like, oh my gosh, do they think I'm bipolar again? I was like, no, not again. But I was like, listen, honestly, it's seasonal, okay? But yeah, as it turns out, that is an ADHD thing. I didn't know at the time, obviously, the things I do now.
And it's an interesting one in terms of like, sometimes you will feel, I feel like, often when my experiences and client experiences as well, you'll be like wrapping up the final details of a project, have difficulty getting things in order, and so feel overly active and compelled to do something else as if driven by a motor. So these things can kind of blend together as well into just one fun afternoon.
That is very true. I could definitely, I feel like this could be one of those like writing prompts where somebody starts it and then the next person like fills in what number 2 would be. Anyway, maybe I'll get that started on our Instagram.
Yeah.
That'd be fun.
Just like respond. Yeah, we'll just do the test together. But yeah, and then they have some other questions about how often are you distracted by noise? How often do you misplace things? How often do you feel restless?
Find yourself talking too much in social situations?
Yeah, gosh. Oof.
Difficulty waiting your turn?
Yeah, we actually have a thing in our academy where interrupting is normalized because we all do it, especially on Zoom. And it's one of those things that you just got to like have grace, and we try and like pay attention to what each other is saying, but also understand that interrupting may happen. I think that helps a lot because and here it is on the assessment test. So that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think it would be really important to mention again, we've talked about this before, but how much you're struggling with any particular symptom is going to change over time. So if you find yourself sort of in a similar situation that feels uncomfortable like the past, and you're like, oh no, not again, it's okay because you've likely learned something this time, or at least you're going to be a little bit more comfortable in that sort of spiral.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Sarah, do you want to drop the self-report scale into the description of this podcast?
I think that would be a really good idea.
Yeah. Have a look, see what you guys think. Feel free to send us any messages. How did you do? What did you think? Did you think it was relevant to your experiences? I think having that kind of, information on a qualitative level is always really, really helpful. And it just gets you a bit more comfortable with the idea of what it looks like to have ADHD.
Absolutely. Information is power.
Exactly. Wonderful. So this has been a very interesting session today. We've talked a little bit about, the differences across cultures and countries, which I really love. I think it's so important. We have so many different countries represented. We work with people from so many different countries. It's really nice to get a sense of what that looks like. But again, also just, the difficulty of getting diagnosed, this is a screening tool and what it looks like to get a screening tool. It might overassess ADHD and what that means. And just the constant fun diagnostic process discussion that we're always having here on this podcast.
I'm sure there will be another installment at some point.
Definitely.
The research hasn't dropped yet, but we'll let you know.
Yeah, we're still holding out for that genetic testing or something. Just put your finger here and it'll tell you if you have ADHD. Yeah, something along those lines. Awesome. Well, good to see you, and we'll see you next time on the research recap. Awesome. See you later. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reach out or connect with us, you can leave us a message at admin@unconventionalorganization.com.
You can also find out more about our ADHD coaching organization, read our free articles, or sign up to our online courses at unconventionalorganization.com. That's organization with a Z or an S. They both will get you there.
If you'd like to learn more about what we discussed here today, or you want to read the transcript, you can find that at our show notes page at unconventionalorganization.com.
If you've enjoyed this podcast and think someone else might find the strategies and stories helpful, the best thing you can do is share episodes using the share button in the podcast player, or leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify or your podcast player of choice, letting them know why you've benefited from this podcast.
Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back in the ADHD lab next week.